today's session, we are going to look at a very, very potted history of the most early origins of the Cold War. So the period of hostility between the USSR and the USA that lasted the best part of half a century. Now, most people would typically think of the Cold War as following World War II. You've got World War II, USSR, USA, same side, mates. World War II ends, all goes wrong, Cold War. I'm here to tell you, as I hope actually some of you who've studied this for GCSE might know, not quite. I think most people would probably argue that the beginnings of hostility between the USA and the USSR actually go back to the 1917 Russian Revolution, or indeed Russian revolutions. Communist leaders effectively took a coup or staged a revolution, whatever you want to be, but brought Russia from being a czarist nation under the control of an autocratic ruler, the Tsar, into being a communist state, which really alarmed the American government for a number of reasons. One, a number of American-owned businesses were nationalised. That means they were taken out of the control of the American owners, put into the control of the state. Wasn't really a whole lot going on in terms of compensation for that. Number two, fears of global revolution. It was originally a tenet of kind of your pure pre-Stalin kind of pragmatic, let's focus on revolution in one country, communist thinking, that actually communism should be a global movement, that the workers should unite, they had nothing to lose but their chains, and that actually it was the responsibility of communist nations to spread revolution around the world, which clearly alarms the capitalist, democratic American government. And then three, on a slightly lesser level, Americans were left in a bit of a fix, as indeed were the rest of the Allies, when, because of the Russian Revolution, Russia withdrew from the World War I conflict against Germany. So there's some sort of early tensions, which were certainly made worse by the fact that in the Russian Civil War that followed directly after the Russian Revolution, where you've got the Reds on the one side, who, funnily enough, were the communists, fighting the Whites, who were the supporters of the Tsar, who had been deposed, the Whites actually received significant financial support from the Americans, which, you know, hurt. No, too strong. Offended the Reds, who considered themselves as the Bolsheviks, the communists, the legitimate government of Russia. I would call all of that background context, because actually, by the early 1920s, things are starting to improve. There is a real famine in Russia in the early 1920s, and the Americans sent a significant amount of aid, of famine relief. That's a movement that's primarily led by the American public, but it receives backing from the American government. Things improve. And also, American businesses started to become cautiously, and not on a massive scale, but not an insignificant scale either, involved in Russian economy, and things kind of start to get a bit better. But just like when you've got a scab and you haven't totally healed it and then it gets knocked off again, it's going to scar more than a fresh wound. Beautiful analogy. It's relevant context. So you've got that. Then there's the immediate build-up to, I've got my little notes here and they disappeared, the build-up to World War II itself. So what's going on in 1930s Europe? Well, kind of main focus for alarm and attention is, of course, Adolf Hitler, who comes to power in Germany, January 1933, and from pretty early on is making noises about having some degree of interest, significant interest, massive interest in taking over lots and lots of land, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, through his policy of Lebensraum, living room. And lots of countries, understandably, are anxious about this. And everyone's pursuing slightly different tactics with what to do about Hitler, what to do about this alarming chap in the centre of Europe, making lots of noise about lots of worrying ideas. And the tactics are not what you could describe as coherent. Now, to some extent, all of the governments have been distracted by the Great Depression, although really probably the more significant factor in Britain and France is that there's absolutely no appetite amongst the public for war. World War I, when World War I breaks out, jingoism, excitement, it's going to be brilliant. It wasn't brilliant. That's remembered. No one has the appetite for war. And it's not really clear what you do about Hitler without some sort of war. So Britain and France pursue, with, certainly defendable intentions, a policy known as appeasement, where they kind of say to Hitler, well, okay, maybe he's a nice chap really, come on, and kind of go along with bits of things that he wants, from rearmament to taking back certain territories. And Stalin in the East is concerned, and Stalin tries to make a deal with Britain and France against Russia. He tries to do that first of all in about April 1939, and he fails, because actually, really, Britain doesn't trust Russia. The British Prime Minister at that time, Chamberlain, doesn't have a huge amount of time for Stalin, primarily because he is a communist. Also, he knows that Stalin is interested in Polish territory. So again, for sort of defensible reasons on Chamberlain's perspective, but also, Russia's made efforts, so Russia's got some reason to feel a bit rejected. That doesn't work out. So instead, primarily actually to buy time, but also to get some Polish territory, in 1939, Stalin and Hitler sign the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which is met with absolute shock and dismay in Western quarters, and the British and the French and the American press was, oh goodness me, they're totally opposed, and look, can you believe Stalin's done this? Whereas Stalin might have argued, well, you know what, lads, I did try. So different interpretations of what's going on. And what's going on in America at this time? Actually, policy of neutrality. There is no appetite amongst the American public for getting involved in yet another, as it would be seen, dispute caused by the Europeans squabbling amongst themselves. They're pursuing a policy of isolation. So again, just a bit of context. It's going to be relevant, bear with me. So what happens next? Well, September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. And so Britain and France are then at war with Germany because they have got their treaty with Poland, and so they have to come on in. Actually, Hitler then very successfully conquers the largest part of Europe until, I'm mad. Forgive me, my battery died. So in June 1941, the launch of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's forces invade Russia, and that's what brings the USSR into the war. And then December 1941, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, bringing the USA into the war. And it is really, really, really important to emphasise that is how this alliance is forged. It's not like the governments of the USA and the USSR and the UK all just sort of saw each other across a crowded bar and said, this is who I want, these are my allies. Not at all. In fact, if anything, if we're going to make kind of dating analogies, it's a bit like they're three bitter exes of the same diabolical, racist man. This is breaking down, but the point is, it's a marriage of convenience. The only thing that all three of them have in common is the enemy of the Axis powers. And that's probably the most important point to emphasise in any answer about why does it all go wrong? Why are they unable to agree on how to govern Germany? Why are they unable to even keep one government of unity going? Because fundamentally, they were brought in it and they've got very, very different objectives. So, everyone is now in the war. Churchill probably has absolutely, definitely has a bit of, nice of you guys to show up, obviously not quite openly like that to America, or indeed openly to any of the governments, but certainly a sense of Britain had been fighting alone for some time. Stalin, meanwhile, pretty quickly, and again, really pretty legitimately, has a sense of, but we are now the only army directly fighting the Wehrmacht in the whole of Europe. Hitler's forces had successfully conquered all of Western Europe by this point, not Iberia, but the north. And Stalin fairly quickly starts saying, chaps, I need you to open a second front. I'm over here in the east, I'm fighting this way and they're fighting this way, and the losses are extreme. Not just the scale of fighting, but the nature of fighting. On the Eastern Front, Hitler's vision for that war is that it is a war of annihilation. It is a racially motivated war in a way that actually the rest of the European fronts, grim as they had been, were not. So the scale and the nature of the fighting is absolutely horrific, and Stalin wasn't really quite ready when they came. I keep saying, can you open a second front, please? Can you open a second front? I need you to launch an attack in France, to divert some troops that way, because I'm really not sure I'm going to make it. And it's not until January 1943, with the victory at Stalingrad, that Stalin starts to feel more secure and more confident. It's worth also reflecting a bit at this point on Stalin's own personality. Stalin is not a chilled kind of a guy. If anything, he'd probably be clinically described today as clinically paranoid. And yet, are you paranoid if they're out to get you? His deepest fear is that really, the reason that they're not opening this second front is because actually it's no skin off those capitalist pigs' noses if the fascists and the communists fight each other in their hundreds of thousands until they're obliterated. And whilst that wasn't true, Stalin had fair reason to consider it at least plausible. So Stalin's over here freaking out about there not being a second front. At various points, second fronts are promised or indicated promises, and talks about invading through Italy and all the rest of it. And in the end, actually, June 1944, D-Day landings, second front is opened, fine. Why was the second front delayed? Well, check out my links. I've got some links, I hope, in the YouTube if I've managed to make it work. According to the Western Allies, very, very plausibly, actually, they don't want to waste life and resource on attacking, with inevitable failure, an incredibly fortified northern French coast, because that would just delay the success of an ultimate successful victory. So they want to be totally ready, and I personally think that's very plausible. Details are given better than I can by military historians in the accounts below. Stalin, again, pretty understandably, is like, well, do you know what? I'm losing people by the million here. I'm sorry that you're not quite strategically ready, but you can see why it was tense. By the time that the war ends, Soviet losses, including military and civilian deaths, are well in excess of 20 million, whereas the USA and the UK have both lost fewer, significant losses, but in comparison to the Soviets, fewer than 500,000 military or civilian people. So, yeah, and when Stalin is asked to comment on what had secured the Allied victory, I think this is quite telling. He says, the British contributed time, the Americans cash, and the Russians blood. And in truth, there's something in that. So, those are the wartime disagreements about the second front and about, who was joining the war when. And then the next bit, just before the war really ends, and we can start to see why things really unravel in the next stage, is disagreements at the wartime conferences. There's 3 wartime conferences where the big 3, as they became known, the leaders of the governments of each of those allies, the Grand Alliance, meet. Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. And it's the disagreements that emerge between Yalta and Potsdam that are really significant. So Yalta, in the Crimean, is in February 1945, and it's becoming clear that there's tensions in the alliance, but they managed to reach some broad headline agreements on 2 things in particular which begin to unravel. One, that Germany will be divided into 4, temporarily for governance purposes when the war is ended, because by this point it's really quite clear that the Allies are going to win. And then Potsdam, in the summer of 1945, they have another conference, and by this point, the other key agreement at Yalta is that there will be free and fair elections in Eastern Europe as the Soviet army liberates those countries from Nazi rule, and specifically a free government in Poland. And by Potsdam, in the summer of 1945, it is clear that Stalin has broken his agreement on free and fair elections in Poland and Eastern Europe. And also Truman, who is the new American president, who is extremely anti-communist and far less diplomatic and generally kind of tolerant perhaps than Roosevelt, his predecessor, who has now died. Truman reveals to Stalin at this point that they have successfully tested an atomic bomb and intend to use it on Japan. And it has been argued by some historians that he deliberately withholds this information and reveals it as a bit of kind of showmanship of, we've got your eye on you, you might have broken your agreements there, but we've now got serious nuclear superiority. Of course, Stalin feigns surprise, but he knows, because he has spies, pretty effective network of spies in London, in Washington, and for him this proves that the trust is broken. For the British and the Americans, behaviour in Poland and Eastern Europe proves that the trust is broken, and the scene is set for our next, what should we call this, misread monologue, on what starts to go wrong once the war is over.